A brass counter pressed into Elena's left shoulder as the Grand Master counted, his gloved fingertips steady. Suspicion tightened the researcher's hands around his leather journal. He kept his breath small and his pen poised. The cloister smelled of beeswax and iron, and the acolyte's tally beads moved in a dry, patient chorus. Within 5 breaths, the ritual registered as a ledger entry, a recorded wound await assigned, a small bronze counter set back on velvet. The concrete problem presented itself without question. The Brotherhood reduced sin to measures and marks. That arithmetic was a system and the researcher meant to prove how it worked. He had come to the cloister believing he could read a set of rules. His suspicion led him to the archive, and his curiosity, another motion, another pulse, led him to cross thresholds the order kept sealed. He was cautious by habit. Mid-40s, lean, spectacles slipping against his nose when he bent, his journal tucked under one arm. He did not move now. He watched the Grand Master tilt Elena's chin and choose a bronze counter as if selecting a ledger pen. The first external event occurred when the Grand Master spoke. "Elena, measure your debt with silence." The line cut across the chamber. An acolyte tightened a strap. Elena hissed, a short sound that held fear and resolve. The researcher wrote the line down, notating the length of the pause between command and compliance. His suspicion changed into a sharpened focus. What instruments did they use, and how did the Brotherhood justify converting flesh into numbers? That question pushed him past polite archiving and into theft. He had broken into the archive 2 nights earlier. In the late evening chill, he forced a rusting lock and found a leather-bound ledger, folding diagrams, and a table of wounds matched to values. He had handled the ledger like a physician handling a scalpel, careful, white-knuckled, listening for footsteps. The discovery informed his present watching. It converted an abstract theory into a dangerous ledger that linked precise cuts to metaphysical liability. He felt an emotion shift then. Suspicion gave way to unease as the ledger's rules revealed social consequences rather than only spiritual ones. After the opening rite, the cloister erupted into routine. Candles relit, leather scrubbed, straps loosened. The Grand Master stepped back. "Beads," he said, and the acolytes tapped a slow arithmetic chant. Elena folded her thin hands over the wound. Her breath came in counted measures. The researcher noted that she breathed to a number, and that she seemed to count inward as if to steady a scale. The researcher moved with practiced restraint. His face remained still, but his fingers mapped the ledger's columns in his head. He had to know whether the marks were immutable or whether, like any account, they could be altered. A month earlier, a defected acolyte had come to him in a riverside tavern. The man called himself Marek. He had spoken in low glances and short sentences, and his confession had been an external event that sent the researcher south from academic curiosity into urgency. "They count the same way every year," Marek had said. "They calibrate with effigies. They test against pain until number and soul align." Marek's hands trembled as he described the calibration chamber. He had given the researcher the location of one sealed room and the name of an instrument. The caliper that measured flesh to a unit. That revelation produced the first real escalation. Marek's presence and information forced the researcher to decide whether to observe or to seize evidence. They left the tavern together at dusk. The researcher listened to Marek's voice. "I counted for them once. I marked names." "I am tired of the counting." Marek repeated the phrase like a ledger entry. The researcher wrote Marek's exact words and the route to the abandoned calibration chamber. Outside, the river smelled of fish and soot. Cart creaked. Marek swallowed. "They will not forgive prying," he said. The researcher felt a second emotion shift. Unease ripened into a cold dread that passed through his ribs as awareness of imminent danger. The calibration chamber lay behind a narrow door. Dust settled under its threshold. Inside, the researcher saw an effigy mounted on a post, wax-filled grooves for measuring, and rusted instruments arranged like a surgeon's set. A table against the wall bore a ledger with fresh ink. He opened the ledger to Elena's name and found a sequence of tallies inked in a quick, machine hand. This concrete discovery moved the plot. Elena existed on a page and in flesh. The Brotherhood linked the two. The researcher traced a row with his finger and counted the units. There, in a margin, someone had written a notation: calibration. Threshold at 12 strikes. The researcher copied the phrase into his journal. He felt determination settle into his movements. He returned to watch a week later during another ceremony. He had learned by reading the ledger which marks corresponded to humiliation, which to reparation, and which to enforced exile. The Grand Master presided over the measuring with ritualized calm. Each tally answers a question, the Grand Master intuned. Each mark restores measure. Elena's voice was barely a thread. "I accept," she said. Her hands clenched around a folded token. When she loosened them, small scratch marks showed on the linen. The researcher moved now with a new motive beyond suspicion. He aimed to prevent a specific tally from being added. He attempted interference during a ritual pause. The acolytes had stacked the ledger on a copper stand in the hall's outer ring. The researcher slid forward under the pretense of adjusting a candle. He reached out and felt the ledger's leather under his fingertips, warm from many hands. He tried to lift it. An acolyte's palm closed on his wrist. "What is your hand doing, stranger?" the acolyte demanded. The exchange was short, 3 lines of rapid voices. "Let go," the researcher said. "You mustn't touch it," the acolyte said. "We record what must be recorded," said the acolyte's companion. The researcher twisted and dropped the ledger to the floor. The sound of it hitting wood was an external event that drew the Grand Master's attention and cut his planned theft into failure. The Grand Master's approach changed the immediate stakes. He stepped close enough for the researcher to smell iron and beeswax, and his voice moved from whisper to command. "Who pries where only we count?" The researcher kept his hands open and spoke his name aloud. That concrete act bought him a hearing but not safety. The Grand Master's eyes scanned the researcher's face, measuring scars and spectacles, reading the journal strap. "You record, you do not decide," the Grand Master. An exchange followed in clipped, controlled lines. "Grand Master," the researcher said, "the ledger belongs to those who cannot speak for themselves. Names speak for themselves." The Grand Master replied, "Elena has agreed to measure." Elena's voice rose then, thin and firm. "Grand Master, I ask to atone. I ask to be measured." Her words were a small, decisive event that shifted attention away from the researcher. The Grand Master counted aloud again and the beads moved. He spoke of the Order's law in measured pulses. Counting, recording, enforcing. The researcher listened and wrote. That night the researcher found a private moment with Elena in a narrow antechamber. She sat with her shoulders bare and string marks reddening the skin at the shoulder where the brass counter had pressed. Her hands moved in small furtive scratches across a folded linen token. "Elena," the researcher said, "why did you mark extra tallies?" He kept his voice low. He placed his journal on his knees and opened it to a blank page. Elena looked at her hands. She did not say repent or repentant. She described a calculation they made that suffering equals weight. "Elena, I thought if I increased my count, I could shorten the sentence later." The line was a mid-chapter twist. She had altered her token to bargain with number. The researcher felt a third emotion shift. Alarm moved into resolve. He grabbed her hands and felt the small needle scars across the palms. She met his eyes. "I am bargaining with the ledger," she said. "I scratched more marks because I believed pain was currency." The researcher sat back and wrote every sentence. He confronted Merrick afterward, forcing another external event. An interrogation in a cellar where rain drummed on the roof overhead. Merrick's answers were clipped. "They taught us to measure sin strictly. Merrick, they justice fails unless pain matches debt." The researcher returned again to the ledger's table, and Merrick produced the location of instruments and the names of acolytes who enforced counts. Their exchange included rapid back and forth lines as they negotiated risk who will change the ledger. The researcher demanded, "You." Merrick's eyes flicked to the alley. "I cannot return," he said. "They will kill me for changing numbers." That admission altered the researcher's options. He could no longer rely solely on defectors. He had to make the ledger public, and attempted theft resumed during a ritual pause the following night. The researcher moved like a surgeon, cutting across a shadowed easel to the ring where the ledger sat. He slipped his cloak over the leather and turned. Acolytes erupted around him, hands seized his shoulders. He shoved and twisted and heard the rasp of a glove against his jaw. The fight lasted seconds, but each second counted as a concrete event. The ledger slipped, a candle toppled, wax splashed against the ledger's edge. An acolyte shouted Elena's name, and the Grand Master's steps were again a new sound that shifted the chamber's balance. The researcher felt something break, not the ledger but the group's order. The Grandmaster stepped forward with cold precision and freed his voice into a ritual counting that restored shape to the chaos. The climax took place on the central ritual days in the pre-dawn hour. The Grandmaster compelled a public measurement. He ordered Alina to kneel and forced the researcher to stand and witness. The Grandmaster's gloves were steady. The caliper he used was polished bronze with a small notch. He lifted Alina's arm and held the caliper to the scarred skin. "We measure to bind," he said. "We mark to balance." The room listened. The researcher felt the counting enter his bones. Every bead on the rosary clicked. He saw the Grandmaster's hand move with a practiced economy. He heard the precise sounds of instruments sliding. The Grandmaster read aloud the ledger's table and declared Alina's debt. That declaration was a formal, concrete imposition of fate. The ritual's enforcement became violent and judicial at once. The Grandmaster pronounced that Alina's secret tally, the one she had scratched herself, would not reduce her sentence. Instead, alteration was an offense against the order. He forced a public measurement and translated the token's extra marks into an augmented punishment. "Alteration is theft of justice," he intoned. Elena's face did not crumble into lyric despair. She tightened her jaw and breathed in counted measures. The researcher felt rage sharpen his hands. He reached out, but an acolyte caught his arm. "Stay where you are," the Grandmaster ordered. "Witness how measure becomes law." The researcher watched as the Grandmaster used the caliper, recorded the measurement, and updated the ledger. In a rapid exchange of dialogue, the Grandmaster confronted the researcher. "You record," he said, "and you will record what you cannot change," the researcher answered. "Then the ledger must be shown. Public shame dissolves the scales." The Grandmaster, "The ledger restores order." Their argument lasted 6 short lines, and each line altered the course of the ritual. Alina signed nothing but bore everything. The researcher escaped the cloister afterward with fragments of the ledger. He tore a single folio from the binding when the Grandmaster's attention was called to the cleansing of salt on a brazen bowl. He ran through rain-slick alleys, his coat plastered to his back and his journal pressed under his arm. The ledger fragment was heavy with ink and with calculations. The script named instruments and values and contained the margin where the Grandmaster had recorded calibrations. In the fragment, someone had written a new tally in a different hand. The researcher smoothed the page and read the last line. A single tally mark followed by his name. The discovery of his own name on that page functioned as a twist that changed how he understood the previous events. It meant the Brotherhood had eyes beyond their cloister, or that a member had anticipated his interference. He held the torn folio and felt the air cold against his cheeks. He walked to a nearby alley where rain ran through a gutter and checked the ledger by the light of a guttering lantern. The tally sat next to a neat notation. Interference accounted. He folded the page into the journal and wrapped it in oilcloth. The chapter's cliffhanger arrived in the middle of the chapter when an acolyte cornered the researcher in a narrow stare and hissed, "We counted you twice tonight." He did not strike. He only left the phrase like a stone in the researcher's path. The external event forced a decision: flee with the ledger or return to force a public exposure. The researcher chose escape, but his choice only postponed a larger confrontation. He spent the next day copying the ledger entries into his own book, translating medieval shorthand into plain notation. He catalogued instruments: brass counters, calipers, folded paper tokens, tally beads, and the bronze counter shaped to press into skin. He recorded how each instrument corresponded to social sanctions: loss of status, confinement, labor assignments, permanent shaming. The Brotherhood system was not merely doctrinal. It integrated civic enforcement with ritual authority. That reality moved his emotion from outrage into a clinical, procedural determination to map connections between ledger entries and civic consequences. 2 secondary characters shaped events repeatedly: Marek, the defected acolyte, and Alina. Marek supplied locations and spoke repeatedly across scenes. His choices limited the researcher's options. Elena's decision to alter her token created the central twist and made the public ritual a necessity. The Grandmaster's ledger entries, in turn, changed from doctrinal statements to active threats. He wrote, he counted, he inflicted. Each name in the ledger carried a consequence that unfolded in the real world. At dusk, the researcher met Marek one last time. They argued in clipped lines: "You cannot publish this alone, Marek," They will hunt you. Then we go to the magistrate," the researcher answered. "The magistrate will not believe an accusation without the original ledger. You have a leaf. Merrick, it will be enough to start rumor, not prosecution." The exchange revealed a second twist. Civic authorities had been quietly on the Brotherhood's payroll. Merrick admitted that the order settled many small disputes by turning them into ledger entries rather than legal records. The researcher felt a cold clarity. If the magistrate was compromised, public exposure might only inflame the order. The final paragraphs tie to a concrete action. The researcher left the meeting, folded the oilcloth, wrapped folio into his satchel, and walked to the cloister wall. Rain blurred the carved stone. He placed a hand on a damp set of steps where he had first watched Elena kneel. He read the ledger again by lantern light and found the last tally beside his name. A footstep sounded. He looked up and saw no one. He closed the book and slid it into his satchel. He ran toward the river, the ledger and his journal heavy at his side, and a cart's wheel through mud behind him. The chapter ends with him stepping from the alley into a wider street, his coat still wet, the ledger folded under his arm, and the certainty that the Brotherhood had already accounted for him. Emotion root, suspicion, emotion shifts. Suspicion, unease, dread, resolve, alarm, determination, rage, clinical determination. He forced the rusted lock at midnight and the bolt gave with a high, metallic complaint as if the stone had been holding its breath. Suspicion tightened his hands around the iron pick. He slid into the monastery archive on silent feet, lantern held low so its smudge of light would not catch in the rafters. The researcher had come alone, because curiosity and method required that he see the ledger unbound, unedited by conversation. He had catalogued inventories and liturgical marginalia for 3 years. He knew how monks numbered candle stubs and recorded oblations. Tonight he sought a system that measured guilt by flesh. That explicit problem, whether suffering could be quantified, sat under every move he made. He moved down the restricted stacks with a flat-shouldered, practical gait, keeping his lantern close to the floor so the light struck only the edges of vellum. His fingers brushed spines that smelled of glue and beeswax. His palm found a seam where the folio had been sealed. He snipped the cord and peeled back the wax. A row of brass counters lay beside a ledger. Each counter bore a punched number and a threaded hole like a rosary bead. The counters were cold against his glove. He set the lantern on a low table and opened the folio. The first page held the title in a careful hand. Moral Arithmetic, followed by columns of tallies and small schematic diagrams of measurement instruments. The researcher paused to steady his breath. Suspicion had pushed him here. Curiosity pushed him farther. He traced the diagrams with a fingertip and recognized, with the same small clarity one feels when a worn tool finally fits a hand, the schematics for a caliper adapted to flesh and a brass counter intended to register pressure. He made a precise rubbing on a spare sheet, tucking the paper into his journal. A sound stopped him. Footsteps on flagstone, quick and practiced. He closed the folio and slid it under his coat. He reached for the lantern. His fingers knocked a pot of iron filings and the clink echoed. A voice whispered, "Brother Martin." The term of address was small, human, meant to test identity. He did not answer with a confession of intentions. He straightened and turned, keeping his face a neutral mask. "I am Brother Martin," he said, meeting a pair of tired, watchful eyes under a cowl. The acolyte held a trencher and a candle stub. His jaw was set. "You are not assigned here at this hour," the acolyte said. The researcher's voice remained even. "I was checking the bindings. I thought the folio had a broken clasp." Suspicion receded into something closer to calculation. What could he reveal without inviting immediate custody? He needed the ledger, not a quarrel. The acolyte, Brother Martin, squared his shoulders and moved to block the doorway. "This is the restricted stack. Leave the lantern and come with me to the prior." Martin's hand rested near his belt in the way of men who have been given responsibility and intend to keep it. They stepped out into the corridor. The lantern threw a thin cone of light along the mortar. Birds of dust banked in that cone and then spilled away. The researcher kept his hands visible and kept his answers short. He had expected this confrontation. He had not expected the ledger's title to be read aloud, or the ease with which the phrase moral arithmetic could translate an academic curiosity into an accusation. Brother Martin's pace pushed them toward the inner chapter, where the Grand Master's habit hung like a shadow against the wall. The corridor smelled of beeswax and old iron, familiar from the night when Elena had received a brass counter pressed into her left shoulder as the Grand Master counted, a detail the researcher could not remember. That memory tightened his grip on the folio hidden beneath his coat. They entered the inner chapter, and the Grand Master stood in the pool of a single, high window. He did not rush. He let the door close behind them and folded his hands in front of the embroidered habit. The researcher recognized the pattern of counting beads and the brass amulet worn at the Grand Master's throat. Those items had been catalogued in passing, dismissed as ceremonial. Tonight they looked like instruments. The Grand Master's voice was low and methodical. "You have been at the ledger," he said. The researcher kept his posture small, his baritone measured. "I found it open. I came to examine the diagrams." He set the folio on a side table with care, tilting it so that the Grand Master would see the title. "So you think the ordering of sin is a thing fit for examiners?" The Grand Master. His fingers found a gloved fingertip to measure an inch of air, an automatic motion that gave him control over space. He spoke Elena's name then as if testing a hypothesis. Elena, the door opened and the young initiate was brought forward. Elena entered pale and breathless, her hands wrapped in bandages that had been noted in his files. Small needle scars along the palms, a faint burn at the base of the throat. She kept her eyes down and moved as if measured steps were part of the ceremony. The researcher remembered, now with a sudden and precise recall, the brass counter pressed into Elena's left shoulder as the Grand Master counted. That scene from the ledger of suffering had lodged behind the researcher's ribs. It made the folio in his coat burn like a brand. The Grand Master did not allow an exchange of platitudes. He moved to a long table, placed a brass caliper beside a bowl of clean water and a brass counter, and said, "Watch. Measure is mercy here." He slid the caliper across the wood with the authority of a man who had never been questioned on his premises. Elena stood at the table, jaw set though her hands trembled. The Grand Master placed the brass counter against the base of her throat and applied the caliper with a slow pressure that read like proof. The researcher watched the numbers align on the instrument's etched scale and felt a line of cold run down his spine. Curiosity had become alarm. His fingers tightened on the folio beneath his coat. "This is the calibration ritual," the Grand Master, counting aloud in a cadence that sounded like rosary beads struck by a thumb. 1 tali equals a cut. 2 equals a score of lashes. The ledger will not lie. His voice hardened when he saw the researcher's reaction. "You came to steal truth, Brother Martin. Instead you will be shown how truth punishes." The room tilted into a different economy, one where investigation counted as trespass. The Grand Master lifted a long, narrow instrument and let it fall once into Elena's palm to test her steadiness. Elena closed her fingers around it and swallowed. The researcher stepped forward, instinct overriding calculation. He reached for the folio and the ledger to take proof for the outside world, for courts, for whatever authority still existed beyond these walls. Acolytes moved in a circle. Brother Martin, who had been the gatekeeper a moment before, now flattened his body into an arresting shape and lunged toward the researcher with hands that had learned the discipline of restraint. "Stop," Martin barked. The researcher twisted and went to the floor under the weight of a second acolyte's grip. A scuffle began. Robes snagged, a chair toppled, the caliper skittered and struck the table with a metallic clack. The Grand Master's command cut through the chaos. He did not shout. He counted off a ritual sentence to order the men into their assigned motions. He lifted his gloved hand and moved the caliper with a ritual precision and then, as if reading an equation, pointed the brass counter at the researcher's sleeve, where a thin dark smear had begun to appear from handling the folio measure. He said, "The ledger counts transgression in all forms. Investigation is sin if it wounds the order. You will account for this." The researcher's throat closed. He lunged again, harder, trying to wrench the ledger free. Hands closed on his arms. Brother Martin's voice was close to his ear. "You should not have come here alone," the researcher jerked. His fingers brushed the table and the folio tore along a sewn edge. A single leaf separated and fluttered down like a shuttered page. The torn page landed near Elena and the brass counter she had worn earlier. The room smelled of hot iron, paper glue, and human sweat. They dragged him upright and forced him before the ledger on the table. The Grandmaster unfastened a small wooden box and presented a bronze flint's knife like a judge revealing a sentence. He did not make long speeches. The ritual performed the rhetoric. "You will make a notation," he said to the researcher, and the demand turned into a command that supplied the only leverage left. The researcher set his pen to the ledger. The tip hovered and his hand shook. He tried to force a line of clarity into the letters, to make the entry read as evidence rather than confession. The Grandmaster watched him and recited the formula for tallying transgressions in a low voice as the researcher wrote. The counting beads clicked against the Grandmaster's palm. The researcher made the notation, each letter a small, cruel calculus. A phrase of trespass, a mark of curiosity. He wrote while acolytes pressed their weight against his shoulders. Each stroke of the pen forced him farther from impartial observation and closer to complicity. When he looked down at the ledger, the column to the right held a list of names and measures. He saw entries for Alina, for the acolytes who had borne marks, for months and rites, and then he saw his own name in a narrow column. A series of small tollies that corresponded to times he had sought out records, a thin note that read, "Unauthorized inspection reason." Inquiry, the page did not hesitate. The ledger considered inquiry an act and registered it as debt. The researcher's breath shortened. Doubt tightened at first. Had he misread the column? Then clarity struck like a cut. The Brotherhood had defined the boundaries of blame and written them into matter. His inquiry had been counted as sin before any verdict. He jabbed a finger at the ledger. "That is wrong," he said, voice raw. "You cannot name me here for research." The Grandmaster's gloved hand brushed the ledger, closing the distance between accusation and proof. The Grandmaster counted off an old litany that the researcher had transcribed in other contexts but never seen used against him. "Names make measure actionable. The Grandmaster, you made a mark in this place. You will help correct it." He slid a packet of folded paper tokens across the table, small slips bearing numbers. The room tightened. Alina lifted her head and met the researcher's eyes for the first time. Her breath came in controlled increments as if she were practicing the count. His name quietly, Brother Martin. Her voice was small but clear, an anchor in the room. He met her and heard a sound like someone trying to decide whether to speak in a language forbidden in that house. The researcher moved toward her and tried to tear his gaze away from the ledger. "Alina," he said, "we can take this outside. We can show the folio." He stopped because Brother Martin bumped his arm and because the Grandmaster's hand covered the ledger like a palm over a still pond. The Grandmaster's eyes pinned him with a patient cruelty. "You will make the entry. The Grandmaster, you will name the transgression and assign the measure. Then we will see how truth adjusts those counts." The researcher felt a cold indexing of consequence. He would be made to quantify the very sin he had set out to expose. He hesitated. Doubt slid into fear. His fingers trembled. His pen hovered. The ink pooled. The acolytes tightened their hold. In a voice that clipped syllables, as if the words themselves were instruments of measure, "Brother Martin, write it plainly." Do not flinch. The command carried the authority of one who had chosen duty over sympathy. He wrote a single, cramped sentence. "Unauthorized inspection, intent. Record extraction." His hand left a smear across the page where the nib had dug too hard. The Grandmaster nodded and then, with a slow motion that unrolled the next proof, asked for the researcher's tally of the pain that the ledger should assign to his act. "How many marks?" The Grandmaster, panic flared in his ribs. He tried to bargain with words. "This is evidence. It must be catalogued outside these walls." The Grandmaster cut him off with a thin smile. "Evidence is a ledger's language," he said. "If you wish to be absolved, place the number that shows contrition. If you refuse, the order will choose for you." The researcher realized the arithmetic had teeth. He had no scale to weigh guilt. He did what interrogators often do. He tested the system with a small transgression and a calibrated number. He set down a figure into the ledger and watched as acolytes shifted and counted that number aloud as if to make it true. The tally echoed through the hall. The Grandmaster lifted the brass counter and struck it against the table. Each impact sounded like a verdict. That moment should have been the end of his agency, but the ledger offered a further cruelty. a column that logged investigations against investigations. The torn page he had let fall earlier, now swept up under an acolyte's foot, had a notation that took his prior notes and referenced them with months of queries he had sent to provincial libraries. The ledger's scope reached beyond the physical chamber and wrapped itself around any action that touched the Brotherhood's order. The researcher felt his role shift from observer to participant, then to accused, and finally to tool. He made a desperate attempt to snatch the folio again. The acolytes dragged him down. The table upended and the brass caliper slid across the flagstone, catching in a seam and stopping. The room erupted into a structured violence, measured, almost ceremonial. Someone spoke Elena's name and she was pushed forward by hands that were not rough, only resolute. The Grand Master signaled and 4 men held the initiate while he applied the calibrated instrument with mechanical exactness to her shoulder. Elena's face clenched, breath short, then steadied as the instrument found its place. The researcher strained against the bonds that held him. He could see through the edges of the struggle how the Brotherhood turned a rescue attempt into evidence of culpability. His attempts at freedom were catalogued as escalations, added to the ledger's columns as if the ledger had reached to record motion. He twisted, found a shard of needle in his palm from earlier contact with the folio, and tasted blood. The Grand Master watched and made a marginal note with a gloved fingertip on the ledger, a small, precise mark, and said, "Observe how the ledger reconciles movement with measure." The room fell to a hush and the counting resumed. When the Grand Master ordered the researcher to make a further entry, he wrote while Elena's name hung between them like an equation. He wrote that he had attempted to remove a page, that he had caused a disturbance, that he had tried to free an initiate. Each phrase scraped at his sense of purpose. He had come to expose a system. Now he had supplied it with the data it required to punish him and to calibrate Elena's suffering. After the forced entries and the ritual measurement, the men unbound him and led him toward the cloister stair. Elena's eyes met his again. She had a folded token pressed into the palm of her hand, one of the numbered slips the Grand Master had set on the table. She slid it quietly into his open palm when the acolytes looked away. Her fingers brushed his. The contact was a small, deliberate act that carried more than the exchange. He felt the token press into his palm through the skin as if weight could mean a decision. Outside, the light had shifted toward morning. He tucked the torn page inside his cloak beneath the folio and felt the dark smear on his sleeve where ink and blood had mixed. He kept his head low and walked the cloister with the measured pace of a man who must not invite pursuit. He thought of the ledger's column that had named him. Its presence in that book altered any future action he might take. The arithmetic of his own mistakes had been written down. A last motion broke the rhythm. A figure at the far end of the cloister, Brother Martin, paused and called. "Brother Martin." The researcher stopped. Brother Martin did not approach. He simply said, "You should have brought me a witness. You should have told me why you came." The researcher swallowed and could not answer. He had come alone by design and paid the price in a tally. He slipped away down the cloister stair with a torn page in one hand and a dark smear on his sleeve. Elena's folded token was folded into his palm like a quiet instruction, a number, a proof, a possibility. The ledger would follow him. The Brotherhood's arithmetic would measure not only bodies but choices now catalogued as entries. The chapter closed with the concrete image of him pressing the torn page to his chest beneath his coat and stepping into a narrow, wet alley where the dawn struck the flagstones in a thin silver line. Emotion roots and shifts guided every choice here. Suspicion that led him to the folio, curiosity that drew him to study its diagrams. Alarm when the ledger listed him. Panic when forced to participate, then a brittle, practical resolve as he left with proof and a new, dangerous knowledge. He had altered his own record. He had become both historian and counted subject. He had left with partial evidence, with a stain that would not wash easily from wool, and with a folded token that might become either leverage or doom. At the end of the chapter, the immediate conflict, the break in, the discovery, the forced notation, the calibrated punishment, was resolved. He escaped with a fragment of the ledger and the knowledge that the Brotherhood had converted inquiry into quantifiable debt. The final image is not a promise or a speech. It is a simple action. He pushed open a sluice gate, stepped through cold stone and rain, and folded the torn leaf into a pocket where it could no longer be reached by the Brotherhood without violence. That single step carried the most dangerous question forward. Who would tolly the tolliers? A brass counter hit Elena's left shoulder hard enough to lift the skin, where the Grandmaster ordered, "Hold still." Suspicion drove the researcher forward along the service stair, his left hand braced on cold stone and the other clutching the leather bound journal that had smelled of beeswax and old ink for months. He kept his pen ready. Suspicion had turned his pulse to a counting rhythm as concrete and precise as the Brotherhood's beads. The altar below gleamed with instruments, calipers, hooks, a bronze counter scored with tiny indentations, and a ledger bound in oiled calfskin. The immediate problem was visible and urgent. If the Grandmaster completed the engraving, the mark would be permanent, and the ledger's numbers would carry beyond the cloister into the town's punishments. He had come that night to stop a ritual, not to watch. The researcher, who had spent nights cataloguing marginalia and copying names from brittle ledgers, had followed a trail of invoices and municipal orders into the cloister's accounts. Concrete entries, payments to the Brotherhood, receipts for ironwork, a municipal warrant with the Brotherhood's seal had suggested the tolly system was used by magistrates. Those pages had moved suspicion into certainty and had pulled him here. He rested his shoulder at the narrow gap in the stair, breath low, and watched Elena press her palms to the table while an acolyte tightened a linen strap across her chest. Elena's jaw worked. The researcher read the small motions like notes. She had the thinness of someone who had slept little and eaten less. Her hands shook when she folded paper tokens and slid them into her sleeve. The Grandmaster counted aloud in slow strokes, numbers like iron chisels. 1, 2, 3. The acolytes shifted tally beads through rosary, like chords, the beads clicking in a steady percussion. The researcher felt a shift, curiosity tightening his hands into a new pattern, because the brass counter on the table bore notches that matched civic fines he had seen in the accounts. If the ledger translated pain to penalties, then the Brotherhood's right had a civil endpoint. The first emotion that pulled him, suspicion, moved into focused curiosity. He lowered himself into the alcove and crept along the wall to a vantage point where the altar's oil lamps did not catch his journal's pages. He needed a single clear image of the ledger, an undeniable record. The Grandmaster's voice cut the air. "Elena," he said, "speak your oath." His rasp sharpened into command. Elena inhaled and recited short lines printed on a slip of paper. Her voice quivered. She counted breaths to keep her words steady. I accept the measure placed upon me." The researcher wrote that line down. The Grandmaster measured Elena with an iron caliper, the jaw's closing finger, thin against her collarbone. He tapped the caliper and marked a number on a folded strip. 1 mark equals 3 denarii of shame, 1 acolyte murmured to another. The researcher registered the specific numbers and the way the Brotherhood reduced the body's geography to units. Suspicion turned toward alarm in him when he recognized a municipal script on one of the folded slips, a magistrate's hand used in payment orders. They moved through the motions of the ceremony with methodical cruelty. The Grandmaster counted, an acolyte pressed a bronze counter against Elena's flesh, and a scribe kept the ledger. The researcher remembered the brass counter against Elena's shoulder from the earlier ledger entry he had read. That image now had a new meaning. The counter did not simply mark pain, it translated it into civic currency. He felt a tightening behind his ribs that was not fear so much as the mechanical knowledge that a system was at work. His next emotion shift came, curiosity shifting into fear as implications unfolded. He slid away after he noted the caliper mark and moved toward the archive alcove described in a fragmented inventory. The archive door resisted at first, but gave when he levered it with a dull iron pick. Inside were shelves of municipal papers and a rolled blueprint tucked under ledger folios. The blueprint was folded tight, annotated in 2 hands. The Grandmaster's deliberate script and a municipal clerk's cramped shortened, the header read. Algorithm of public measures. The researcher's breath shortened. He had found the link that had haunted him. A concrete revelation changed the stakes. The blueprint mapped tally markings to civic punishments. 1 tally equaled a corporal lash. 3 tallies equaled a heavy fine or a week's detention at the workhouse. 7 tallies meant public shaming and property seizure. The researcher traced lines with his finger despite the cold. Each line connected a ritual instrument to a civic sanction. The Brotherhood's instruments were not only tools of penance, they were calculators of control. He heard footsteps. The monastic scribe, a man named Brother Anselm, whom the researcher had encountered in ledger margins before, stepped into the alcove with a lantern. Brother Anselm's robes were patched at the elbow, his hands stained with iron dust. The researcher held the blueprint with both hands and did not hide it. "Brother Anselm," he said, voice low, "these maps tie your orders to the magistrates." Brother Anselm's eyes widened for a fraction. The scribe reached for the paper and then hesitated, fingers hovering. "You should not carry this around, Brother Anselm, tightly. The Grandmaster will have our throats for this." The scribe's voice had the thinness of a man who had recently lost sleep and who still counted coins over old ink. The researcher kept his tone controlled. "Anselm, the ledger is evidence. The town will not punish without these marks." You know that Brother Anselm's hand trembled and then steadied. He folded the blueprint inward and tucked it under his robe. A new external event. Distant shouting came from the corridor. An acolyte had noticed a creak on the stair. The researcher and Brother Anselm moved as one toward the sound. They peered into the corridor. 2 acolytes had spotted a displaced slate and were checking the lower stair. One of them glanced up and saw a shadow behind a narrow window. The researcher ducked back into the archive and pressed his shoulder against cold wood. He had to decide. Seize the ledger here and risk immediate capture, or return to the ritual and attempt to prevent the engraving. Suspicion and fear mixed into a resolution. He chose to act directly. He stepped from the archive and crossed the cloister with the blueprint pressed to his chest. Acolytes blocked his path and a scuffle began. "Stop him!" one shouted. The researcher shoved past, knocking rosary beads from an acolyte's wrist. Beads scattered like copper rain across flagstones. The Grand Master's voice rose to a rasping command. "Seize him." 2 acolytes lunged. The researcher swung his satchel at one, the leather thudding against a shoulder, and Brother Anselm shoved a heavy folio into another's path. The confrontation unfolded in short, clipped lines. "Stop." The researcher barked. "Leave him." The Grand Master then faster. "Hold him, you will not touch the book." Brother Anselm snapped. "Let him go," the researcher ordered. "Elena." "Stand down," the Grand Master. Those exchanges were rapid and raw. 3 quick lines for each clash, each sentence a move. Acolytes grappled and pushed. The researcher reached the altar chamber. The Grand Master stood with the ledger in his hand, a bronze flence knife at his hip, tally beads in the other. Elena was strapped to the instrument frame with linen, her head bowed, lips dry. The Grand Master's fissured scar caught lamplight. He smiled without humor. "You should have stayed on your side of the wall," he said to the researcher. His rasp carried no surprise. The climax described in the outline arrived. The researcher lunged for the ledger while the Grand Master began the engraving. The ritual's cadence was a bell. The Grand Master's low counting, Elena's forced breath, the acolyte its bead clicking. The researcher reached the table and knocked the ledger with his elbow. The book slid and slammed open. Pages fanned and a metal tooth of the counter grazed Elena's skin. The Grand Master's gloved hand moved to seize the ledger back. The researcher had 2 concrete choices. Destroy the ledger, removing evidence but risking chaos, or pull Elena free and stop the immediate marking while the ledger remained. He chose to break the system. He raised a hammer he had kept in his satchel and struck the ledger's binding. The binding cracked with an audible split. Leather and thread tore. The Grand Master lunged and a melee erupted. Elena's breath left her in a single, high sound when the counter dug into her shoulder. The researcher grabbed the bronze counter and tossed it toward the stone floor, where it shattered against the altar step. Tally beads flew across the chamber. The Grand Master's counting broke into a curse. Dialogue erupted between the principal players in short bursts. "Stop this," the researcher said. "No," the Grand Master hissed. "You will not steal our order." The Grand Master. "Elena, keep still," he added. Elena answered in a thin line. "Please." Brother Anselm shoved a table and struck an acolyte, yelling, "Brother, hold the ledger!" The acolyte answered, "I will not be shamed." The exchanges were fast and jagged. Each line pushed the physical struggle forward. There were 3 to 6 quick returns in the central argument as bodies bumped and hands reached for the torn paper. The physical escalation produced a sharp twist. A junior acolyte, a familiar face the researcher had seen counting beads quietly in an archive corner, Mathis, stepped between the Grand Master and Alina and spoke with sudden clarity. "Stop the mark, Mathis. This is not the Master's decree. You are making rules for yourself," his voice carried across the chamber. The Grand Master's eyes narrowed. Mathis had been an acolyte for years. His act of defiance changed the room's understanding of allegiance. The researcher realized Mathis had been keeping his own ledger of incidents and had seen the Grand Master manipulate counts to remove rivals' property. Mathis's intervention was a pivot, an unexpected reveal that altered motives. The Grand Master moved to silence Mathis, but Brother Anselm took advantage of the moment and shoved a bench between them. The acolytes hesitated. A small mid-chapter cliffhanger snapped the moment. The Grand Master reached for the Flint's knife. Time condensed to motion. Everyone saw the knife's dull bronze catch light. The researcher stepped forward and yelled, "No knife!" The shouts and the reach froze the chamber for a beat. That hesitation allowed the researcher to drag Alina free. He ripped the linen strap with his hands and slid her toward the doorway. She fell into his arms, her skin slick with sweat and a smear of blood where the counter had pressed. He heard the Grand Master breathe in, counting under his voice, preparing for a final escalation. "The Grand Master, you think you can undo what I have calculated." His voice had the old certainty that had governed him for decades. The researcher answered in a steady tone, "It's not calculation. It's theft, concrete accusation." The Grand Master's mouth tightened. Chaotic motion followed. The ledger lay in shards across the altar. The bronze counter split and revealed a hollow core with a hidden compartment. Inside, a tiny roll of municipal receipts and a stub of a magistrate's seal. That discovery was the second twist. The Grand Master had kept direct municipal endorsements tucked into the instrument. The Brotherhood had been acting as a shadow office for civic punishments. The ledger was a public-private apparatus. The presence of the seal made the town's officials complicit. The researcher and Brother Anselm moved quickly. Brother Anselm pocketed the municipal stub and whispered, "This proves them." The Grand Master's posture roiled between anger and calculation. He barked for order and then, unexpectedly, ordered the acolytes to stand down. His voice changed from command to a measured concession. "Take the girl, then, and go." He gestured toward the cloister steps. He did not attack. Instead, he arranged the acolytes to form a ring and slowly retreated to place. The ritual collapsed into an awkward, bruised standoff. The Brotherhood's authority had not been physically broken. It was fractured. The dawn moved through the high lancet windows like a blade. The researcher sat with Alina on the cloister steps while acolytes gathered the larger fragments. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could not hold a cup. He pressed a cloth to her shoulder where the brass had nicked the skin. She voiced thin. "I wanted absolution," he answered. "You wanted order." That exchange was small but precise. Then Alina spoke again. "Was I wrong?" She paused to breathe, counting her inhalations to steady her voice. "No," the researcher said. "You were used." He was careful, observable. He folded his pen closed and set it on his knee. An external event occurred. A magistrate's messenger arrived at the cloister gate, panting and dirty from the road. He bore a sealed writ demanding the Grand Master's presence for inquiry. The municipal seal on the writ matched the stub found inside the counter. Brother Anselm met the messenger at the gate, took the writ, and read in a voice flat as a ledger entry. The messenger said, "The magistrate demands answers about unauthorized punishments." The researcher watched the Grand Master's face register a precise calculation. His next emotion shift moved from fear into resolve. This was no longer only about preventing a marking, but about exposing system-wide corruption. The Grand Master's response was ceremonial restraint. He wrapped his hands around his brass amulet and said numerically, "If the town interferes, statutes will be referenced. If the town refuses, men will choose order by other means." His rhetoric was specific and thinly veiled threat. Brother Anselm spoke up, voice steady. "We collected fines for the town at the Grand Master's command. The town knew this. There are signatures." The messenger's eyes flicked to the Grand Master and then back to Anselm. The researcher stepped forward and produced the torn blueprint. He opened it and showed the municipal mapping. The messenger read and paled. At that moment the room divided. Some acolytes chose the Grand Master's certainty. Others, including Mathis and Brother Anselm, lined with the researcher. The division became a concrete negotiation. The magistrate's messenger said, "The magistrate will send a notary to catalogue the ledger. If false punishments are found, the town will impose restitution." The Grand Master hissed and clenched his jaw. "You will not hand us to strangers," he said. Mathis raised his voice. "We followed matches because we were told to. We do not want this tyranny." The researcher watched the Grand Master's hooded eyes and noticed the ritual burns along his jaw. Evidence the Grand Master had once put himself under the same measures he now enforced. That detail reframed him. Not only a functionary, but a man hardened by his own rights. The final concrete action closed the chapter. The ledger fragments, the broken brass counter, and the tolly beads were placed into a wooden box. Brother Anselm locked the box with a heavy iron hasp and handed the key to the magistrate's messenger, who said he would deliver it under escort to the magistrate's clerk. Elena sat with a cloth on her shoulder and watched as Mathis arranged the remaining tali beads into a neat pile on the altar. She picked up one bead with trembling fingers and handed it to the researcher. He held it for a long beat and then slid it into the inside pocket of his leather-bound journal. That single movement was concrete, visible, and decisive. The researcher catalogued the night's events in short, clinical lines. He photographed the torn ledger and the municipal stub, copying the clerk's handwriting into his journal. He wrote down the Grand Master's exact words about measures and then closed the book. The chapter's resolution came without gallows rhetoric. The town would now possess evidence. Individuals had made choices. Elena would recover with bandages and an external mark that might be used to identify her in court, but also as testimony. The Grand Master retreated to his chamber to marshal supporters. He had not been captured, but his authority had been exposed and compromised. By the time the sun cleared the cloister's highest stones, the immediate conflict had been resolved into concrete outcomes. The magistrate's writ promised an inquiry. Brother Anselm volunteered to give testimony. Mathis pledged to hand over his own notes. The researcher closed his journal and tucked the single tali bead behind its first page. He photographed the wound on Elena's shoulder for record and then helped her to her feet. Elena's resolve had shifted across the chapter, from stubborn curiosity to fear under the caliper, and then to a bruised but clear determination when she chose to step away from the altar. Her voice had been small but direct when she later told the magistrate's clerk exactly who had signed the orders. The final image of the night was concrete. The researcher boxed the remaining fragments, slid the key into Brother Anselm's palm, and watched the Grand Master walk away with the measured gait of a man who still believed in ordered pain. The researcher did not celebrate. He locked his journal and felt a new responsibility. He had prevented an engraving, broken the ledger, and handed the proof to the town. Yet the mechanisms of control remained threaded through civil records. He had moved suspicion into action and then into documentation. His emotional arc ended in deliberate calm. He left the cloister at noon after depositing evidence with the magistrate's clerk. As he closed the magistrate's door behind him, he ran a finger along the inside cover of his journal and felt the small bead he had hidden. It was a hard, cold thing, but it felt like proof. The last concrete beat was a cataloguing decision. He wrote the bead's number in the journal's margin, dated it, and wrote the location where the ledger fragments were stored. Then he closed the cover and locked the study door. The chapter ends on that precise motion. A recorded bead, a sealed box, and a magistrate's writ on its way to public record. The Brotherhood's measures were broken tonight, but not eliminated. Names were spoken aloud. The town had a paper trail that could be followed. The researcher walked down the town's main street carrying the weight of evidence, and the careful knowledge that order often returned where gaps remained. He had moved through suspicion, through fear, to a final resolve that expressed itself in action and record. Elena's shoulder would scar. Brother Anselm would testify. Mathis had sworn to hand over notes. The ledger's pieces sat in a crate to be counted, and the researcher slid a single tali bead into his journal, then closed it and walked on.